Thank you for joining me for Summer Scares Author Talk with Alma Katsu. I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And then we're here to discuss your novel, The Hunger, and your inspiration and the true facts behind it.
Well, thank you for having me.
So what starting out with what caused you to become interested in the story of the Donner Party?
Well, a long time ago, when I was in grad school, I touched on the story of the Donner Party a little bit for a screenplay I was working on. It was just, a project that you have for school, and it did have to do with cannibalism in sort of a roundabout way. So, I kind of looked into it a little bit at the time. And I remember thinking, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to have to come back to it. So then years later, when I did look into the story of the Donner Party, it's really quite amazing. So first of all, I'm a little older, and I had certainly heard about the Donner Party in school. They don't tell you much, at least at the time, right? They just sort of hinted there were these pioneers working across the country and something bad happened to them, and then, they move on. But when you look into the actual story of the Donner Party, you find out that it wasn't just this very unfortunate incident that happened, at the summit in the mountains where they were snowed in, and that forced them, into this horrible situation. But it literally started from thousands of miles back on the trail. Horrible, crazy things happened. Coincidence? I mean, it just screamed out for a treatment of a horror story. And then, of course, there's other aspects, which I'm sure we'll get into, about the history at the time, what America was going through, that the story of the Donner Party is actually sort of a good exemplar for. It all just sort of came together for this story that also seemed to be very fitting for what America was going through at the time when the book first came out in 2018.
Was there one particular part of the Donner Party that you really connected with? Like, I mean, you mentioned all of the coincidences, but was there some part of that story that really pulled at you?
Well, for a writer, I think the main thing is when you hear a story, whether it's somebody telling you a story or it's, a bit of history that you stumble on or something that you read in the newspaper, we might be a little weird and sort of connect with stories in a different way than your average, well-adjusted, normal person would. So for me, what really struck me was, here are these people who, now I am talking about the very end of the journey, they're pretty much traveling with their immediate family in most cases. The Donner Party was about 100 people, 7 families, a handful of individuals who were also traveling with the wagon party. But, and you find that you're trapped. You can't go back, you can't go forward. The snow is 30 or 40 feet tall. I mean, you can't get through it. And you've already run out of food. And here you are surrounded by your family members, your children looking you in the face, and you're all starving. And what are you going to do? For a writer, that is like, such an amazing thing to try to explore through story. Yes, it's very unpleasant, but again, writers are kind of weird, and that's the kind of thing that we just live for.
Was there a reason that you chose to jump between the different timelines and go back to give the background on why all of the characters made the journey or started on the journey?
Yes, because when I was doing the research and kind of looking into it, I was very struck by how different life was back then compared to what we know now in modern times, right? So here were these people, and they were just among the first wave of the settlers. They were really the last year before the big boom, where there were when there was just a continuous stream of settlers going across the country. But, it's almost unfathomable for modern people to think of what it must have been like back then. I mean, there were no roads. They talk about the wagon trail, but the Donners had to blaze a lot of trails because, they took that wonky, not really, not really a passable way. But there's no communications. A lot of times when we think of Western settlement, we think of telegraphs or Pony Express. Well, none of that existed then. They were literally going into the unknown. And so I had to ask myself, well, what kind of person does that? Like, could you picture doing that today? I know we all say we're up for an adventure, but I don't think that modern people really really, embrace that level of wildness and adventure very easily. And yet it was a very kind of common thing back then. When you read the newspaper accounts, people did just sort of up and decide one day, oh yeah, I'm gonna try my hand, move to Oregon or California. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at what would motivate a person to give up everything they knew, everything they own, all their friends and their family, to plunge into the unknown and maybe never come back. And so that you would understand the characters so much more if we kind of looked at what came before and what was their motivation for moving on. It might have been a little unexpected, I think, for some readers. But by and large, the feedback I've gotten is that people have really enjoyed having that extra richness of the backstory, really kind of helped them understand the characters better.
Was any of that based on actual historical evidence, or was that the backstory where those all fictitious elements?
A little bit of both. And this is the funny part, and we can get into a discussion if people are interested. There's such a wide spectrum of what is historical fiction. But there is a certain part of the audience for it that sort of expects it to be, you know, just one step removed from nonfiction, that it should sort of be a documentary with just sort of made up dialogue or something. Well, this obviously isn't, although I have had some readers get very mad when they find out that it actually is not only fiction, but it's, as they're advertised, they're reimaginings of historical events. But so it's all a little bit of a mix generally. So as a writer, I was trained to be literary fiction writer, which generally means it's character driven fiction. So less about the plot, the actual story, what happens next and that sort of thing, but that you really have this whole well-rounded three-dimensional character who's so much like a real person, and that if you understand them, then how they're going to behave, what they do, is inevitable, right? The person they are could only behave a certain way. So for me as a writer, it's really important for me to feel like I really understand those characters. So I do end up with a little bit of armchair psychology going on. And I look at the background of the characters, the main characters, what I can find from the historical record. And then I try to sort of project, why would a person like this go on this journey? Why would they do these things that we see them doing on the trail? So for all of the backstory, there's a bit of a mix. Like for Tamsin Donner, she really was a school teacher when she was very young. She was a school teacher in Cullowhee, North Carolina. I was so enamored with that, we almost bought property there. She did have a husband, young husband, early on. They were the same age. He ended up dying. I forget if it was from typhus or something like that. And, she didn't know what she was going to do with her life. And through her brother, she ended up meeting George Donner and, marrying this guy who was so much older than her. So I just kind of took what I thought a woman like that would be. She really was interested in botany, even though she wasn't a trained botanist or anything. She wanted to write a book about the indigenous flora of the area, stuff like that. And so I could sort of picture this very intelligent, somewhat ambitious woman, and then the situation she finds herself in and what that might do to her personality and her character and how she might be perceived by other people who don't really know her well, that sort of thing. But I do get a lot of emails from readers who say, reading The Hunger and my other book, The Deep, this one, which is about the sinking of the Titanic, makes people very curious, and they go out and they want to find out everything they can about the real history, because they want to know where the line is, what did I make up and what was real.
In terms of what was real, you mentioned a couple of Native American rituals, like there was that focus on the sacrifice between the trees. How much of that was just pure conjecture, and how much of that was based on actual Native American rituals?
So a lot of that, I mean, again, it's sort of a marriage of the two, but
Mhm,
it was interesting. I mean, my background is not in the main Native American culture, and unfortunately, there's not a lot online, right, to
mhm,
kind of help you through it. What does exist is often a little sparse,
mhm.
or you find that things are redundant. Um, Even the same text gets repeated at a number of sites, for instance. It ends up being sort of very self-referential. So I should back up a little bit. My background is actually, basically, I'm a researcher. I was an intelligence analyst for decades. I retired from the intelligence community a few years ago. And so I have about 30 years in as a researcher doing very complex research problems. So I feel pretty confident with my research skills. Because this was a work of fiction and not a reference material, I didn't feel the need to really do super deep research on a lot of the topics, as long as I felt like I was at a comfortable place in order to tell the story I wanted to tell. So I did do research, especially on Western Native American groups, which I'm definitely less familiar with. I'm an East Coast girl. Um, so I tried to stay fairly faithful to stories that I had read. The one about the sacrifice was sort of an extrapolation, and I looked into other Native American and Central American um, Native tribes, human sacrifice um, rituals and that sort of thing to draw on. The other interesting thing is, you know, during the time that the book was written, there was this whole issue of, appropriation of ethnicities and cultures, other cultures than your own, and, especially in the young adult community. So my publisher did was a little concerned to make sure that we weren't crossing any lines. None of us are Native American heritage, and so you don't want to insult anybody, you don't want to
Mhm.
be insensitive. So we did end up using a Native American sensitivity reader who made a lot of really great suggestions for the book, ways we could make it read a little bit more authentic. So um hopefully that was successful. I certainly haven't heard any complaints. Um, in some ways, I felt like maybe we could have done more with a Native American perspective, but maybe I just wasn't the writer to do that.
Mhm. Was there a particular character that you connected with more versus the other ones?
That's interesting. I mean, I'll tell you what I found kind of funny was the Aletha character,
Mhm,
Aletha Donner, who, hears voices and, is a little bit more open to the spiritual plane. I mean, I have never had children and I write adult fiction. So I don't consider myself to have a particularly good ear for children, for instance. I'm just not around them. And I didn't feel like I had a knack for that. But darn, if her chapters were not the easiest ones to write, like there was just something about her that I could connect with very easily. Maybe it was the hearing voices part. I had a lot of fun with that. Did it seem like she was the funnest one for me to write?
I really enjoyed her character. We were debating that last week when we had our discussion, just trying to figure out which ones we liked more.
Ah,
And so that was she was mentioned, and I think we liked the fact that she heard the voices, because that just gave her that unique aspect that a lot of them, they're all the, what do you call them? The cow, not the cowboys, but the guys who take care of the oxen.
oh, the drovers.
Drovers, thank you.
Yeah,
They're like they all kind of blend together.
yeah.
Like you only kind of know one or the other because one's a bigger creep than the other one.
And I didn't mean for them to be all creeps.
Well,
Um,
no, but like if they weren't creepy, they were just kind of blended into the background. And so it was very interesting when her character came up because, like you knew exactly what was going to be going on because she was hearing voices and everything like that. So you knew something was going to happen during her chapter.
Yeah, she was an interesting character. I mean, the whole voices thing came about when I read about Ash Hollow, which was the Hunter's Shack, which is a real place. You can visit it. And that people used to talk about communications. They used to write letters and just leave them under rocks, not only at Ash Hollow, but all along the trail, just in the hope that somebody who was heading back east would find them and take them to a post office and then they'd be mailed. Because in the old days, the receiver is the one who paid the postage. So you could just drop things off like that. I mean, which I find just, you know, phenomenal. I mean, what does that say about Americans and optimism and that sort of thing? You can just be in the wilderness and someone's going to find your letter. But once I heard about that, I just could see the opportunity of somebody who would look at the letters, but the letters would be telling you something else on the page. um, yeah, so she was a lot of fun. It was, speaking from a writer's perspective, that was one of the challenging things about writing about that, because there were 100 characters, right? 100 people in the wagon train. And as a writer, it's hard for readers to juggle a lot of different characters in a book. People complain about it all the time, even if you have like a cast of characters page in the beginning or in the appendix or something. Nobody likes to flip back and forth right through the pages to remind themselves who's who. So, it was a bit of a challenge. I knew it was going to be an ensemble cast, so to speak, with about 6 or so point of view characters who actually got to speak. But then how do you keep all of those people in the background distinct in readers' minds so that, they'll feel comfortable enough when they pop back up that they sort of remember who they are. Yeah. And that can be tough. I haven't gotten too many complaints about that, but occasionally somebody will say, too many characters in the book. Boy, they should think about the Titanic. 2,300 people.
Oh
Yeah, to
goodness.
deal with. Yeah, it was a challenge.
While you were writing the multiple characters, I guess what is your process? Is it a linear process? Like you know where you're going to start, middle, and end? Do you go, I want to write what I know about this character's story first and write that all out? Or did you just kind of interweave it as you go?
I know, some folks don't tend to read a lot of multiple POV books. They're used to having one character and following that narration all the way through. So I know it probably looks in some ways like it's trickier to write than it really is. I was pretty linear. For one thing, going back to the research, so this is something that I would call a complex historical event, because it's more than just one thing, right? There's a timeline that you have to adhere to, right? Because historical fact, where they, like at every point along the way, we know where they were, what day, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got the geographical location, you've got the timeline, you've got the characters. I was really lucky in that I found this book that I think it was the Nevada Historical Society put out, which was, I think it's called the Donner Party Chronicles. I still have it. I will never give that book away. I had to get a used copy, but it was actually a day by day, like, journal of what happened along the trip, pulling in a lot of different sources. The guy who wrote it did a phenomenal job. So it was very, very helpful. But, so it was just a matter of looking at the timeline and deciding, what events need to happen at what points along the way, and deciding who's the best point of view character to take that piece, because they're gonna, their position or their thoughts or how that event impacts them makes them, the best one to tell the story at that point. So it actually was surprisingly linear. Are you surprised by that?
I am actually, because to me, I'm like, well, I like the character driven part. So I feel like if you're connecting with one character, why wouldn't you want to just keep writing that? But the way you describe it makes sense. Like you can't write Tamsin running off and doing her thing at the end when you still haven't gotten the rest of the party there. So it's not going to work out like that.
It's yeah, this is all of the sort of technical part of writing, right? Like, when deciding point of view character or characters, is it going to be first person, third person, um, past or present tense? All of these things do a certain thing to a story, right? It changes the mood or it changes the ability to know something. So, for instance, if you write an entire book in first person, you're limited to only what that person can know. And that works for some things like mysteries, because you need to suspend what's actually going on. And so the one character can learn things as you go along. But for other stories, you need to know all these things that this character maybe there's no way they could know that. And so these are all the decisions that a writer has to make. Yeah, that's one of the things you kind of learn in the first couple books. And then you realize, wow, this is a lot more complicated than I thought it would be.
Margaret asked, during your research, did you come across any facts that stood out to you, whether they were good facts or bad?
Well, the whole thing was very interesting. So, I'd mentioned I'm a little older probably than a lot of your patrons. I grew up during the golden age of the TV Western. So when I was young, we watched Bonanza and we watched The Rifleman and Wagon Train and, all of those shows. And so you think about the Old West and all that stuff. And I found out that no, those TV shows actually lied a little bit. And they did it, for convenience of making a TV show. But it was really kind of eye-opening. And then as a writer of this, you want to try to be true to what happened at the time. But then you have to fight popular perception in a lot of ways. Like arguing with editors, they didn't understand that people don't sleep in wagon trains. I mean, in their wagons, that the wagon was like a moving van. It wasn't like an RV where, you're camping out along the roadside. And they actually would take out tents and, pitch tents at night and sleep in the tents. It's so to me, as just someone who likes facts, all of those things to me were fascinating. It might not be quite the fun, what Margaret's thinking of, like some big, big surprise or something. But it was nonstop, really very interesting, because I didn't know much about the westward expansion. I didn't know much about, what it took to open up the West. And, I learned all of the soundbite things you learn about the history that you learn in class, but the reality was a lot more complicated. Why Americans were heading across the country and the people who were actually encouraging that. We touch on it a bit in The Hunger, Lansford Hastings and his role in this whole sorry debacle. I mean, it was very politically motivated to an extent. Whoops, I can't hear you.
Have you visited any of the places that were mentioned in your story? Have you traveled the Oregon Trail?
So I did about half of the Donner Party route. My editor thought it would be a great idea. And, I'm a researcher and I'm like, really, it's unnecessary. Everything I need, I can find, right? And I'm glad I did, because it really brought it home to me. So we went from Fort Bridger out to Donner Pass, about 700 miles. But of course, we had the benefit of doing it in an SUV with air conditioning. And you can't travel the actual trail for the most part, because a lot of that's on private land now. But Route 80 does go along that same way, so you can get pretty close. And it was really fascinating to see what they went through, the terrain, how incredibly rugged it was. And to think that all they had was a wagon, and wagons are a lot worse than SUVs. I mean, they're very rigid with no suspension really. And just, 4 oxen pulling these big, heavy things, over very uneven land. And it was just fascinating. So yeah, and seeing Fort Bridger, which actually wasn't the Fort Bridger of the time of the Donner Party, because it ended up being burnt down during the Mormon Wars. So what you see now is a reconstruction. But being able to be there and kind of get a flavor for what the outposts, must have been like, and then of course going to Donner Park itself, which is incredibly eerie. It's, if you really know like what happened walking along there. It's just, I could barely stand it. And then when you go out to Alder Creek too, which is the second part where the Donners were actually stranded, and that's so much quieter. And it's just, breathtaking, but eerie, very, very, I would not want to be there at night.
Excuse me. When you were writing this, and what made you decide to do it as a horror and not just a historical novel?
Well, to me, well, two things probably. One is I do probably just have like a really horrible outlook on life. Like I think life is pretty horrible most of the time. I come by it honestly. One of the things I did for a long time as an analyst is I studied like genocides and mass atrocities. So I do I've seen, right, the worst of human nature, and it's pretty bad. I mean, like what people are actually capable of. And that's sort of the theme behind the book. What does it take to turn a man into a monster? You see in the book that it's like a little kernel that's in there in most people. And all it takes is this confluence of circumstances to push that out. And that's sort of the question at the end, when those people are facing the absolute worst thing they could possibly face. That's starvation in the mountains, surrounded by your loved ones. There's no food. They have the added, bonus of being surrounded by these, you know, man-eating creatures. you know, which are the people who are going to succumb to that and become monsters themselves, and which ones are going to be the heroes who are going to try to save their fellow man and sort of rise above it all. So, I kind of see that in most everyday life. So bad on me. But then the other thing is, when I was doing the research and I was seeing all of the things that happened, because like I said, a lot of crazy things happened in that first half of the journey too. It just struck me that it was a horror story, that here was this, like a lot of weird circumstance and a lot of bad things happened to these people, unexplainable things happened to these people. And it just lent itself, right, to a horror story. I should say that, the book originally weighed in at over 600 pages, and it followed the wagon train pretty closely. And at a certain point, my editor read it and she said, I think we should cut some of this out because a little bleak goes a long way. So yeah, she ended up cutting 200 pages from the manuscript. So a lot of the really spooky early stuff ended up real things that happened ended up being taken out.
Was there a reason that you brought in the man-eating monsters as opposed to just letting the psychosis create the horror?
So, hopefully it's a little open-ended, right? In
Mm-hmm.
the earlier version of the book, it was more definitively a type of monster. And it leaned more heavily on the Native American folklore. But one of the things I noticed as I was writing the book is, almost every culture has some version of a shapeshifter, right?
Mm-hmm.
The monster that has both the monster and the man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the personality. And so I thought it would be interesting to leave it as a little bit more of an open-ended question. What is out there? Is something out there? We think there's something out there. Could it be a man? And then there's also that possible explanation, that it really veers more towards the end, that it is, a natural phenomena that occurs through man. But it's a little open-ended. So it's interesting to see how readers, how they interpret it at the end, what they think their is at play out there in the woods.
Do you think you could ever get your publishers to release the book with all of the uncut pages or
No.
no?
600-page book is kind of a hard
Hard
thing to
sell?
convince. Yeah, it's a hard sell. I think only
Uh,
fantasy readers like books that long these days, right?
yeah, yeah. When you began writing in general, what drew you to it as a career, as a possibility?
Well, like a lot of writers, I grew up a reader when I was a little kid. I always was reading a book. I was always in the library. I was one of those, introverted, lonely, weird little kids. And so I think when you read a lot, you want to write. You want to be able to do this thing that's given you so much pleasure. So I started writing when I was very young, writing stories when I was a teenager. Again, very common. And back then, pre-internet, it was hard to know. I wanted to be a novelist, but I didn't know how you became a novelist. The only thing I could see where someone made a living writing was in newspaper work. And so that's what I gravitated to. So I was a stringer for a long time, and I was doing other work, but I was also a newspaper stringer. And people were saying, you can't write a novel unless you have something to write about. You need experiences. So, and I was writing short stories at the time, and they weren't really getting anywhere. But and then somebody told me about NSA, the National Security Agency. And again, this was a long time ago, pre-internet, and we lived in Boston, very far away, right from Washington, D.C. I'd never heard of the National Security Agency. And they were telling me all these stories they heard about what a crazy place it was, and how just even the application process was very strange. And so I thought, well, I'll apply, and that'll be an experience. I'll just start to collect these experiences. So I applied, and I guess I tested well, because they came back and they said, we want to offer you a job. And I didn't think I'd go, but then I thought, well, maybe just for the experience, I'll go for a few years. And I told them that. I said, this isn't going to be a career for me. I'm just going to maybe 5 years, and then I'm going to leave. And they were like, oh, fine, sure. Uh, you know, and I stayed, my entire adult life. I mean, it was a great career. It was very interesting, but I had to stop writing, of course, at a certain point. They really don't like, in the intelligence community, they don't really like you getting your name out there, even if it has nothing to do with intelligence work. And especially back then, this
Mhm.
was in the 80s. And so I stopped writing, and I stopped writing for a long time. But I was very lucky to decide later in life that I wanted to go back to it. I didn't sell my first book until I was 50, which is pretty unheard of. It's uncommon, let's just put it that way. Yeah. So there you are, more than you probably wanted to know.
I mean, obviously you can't tell us anything about your career because of, legal reasons and all of that. But what, I guess, what was that experience like? I mean, I'm a researcher, I'm a reference librarian, so I dig through newspapers and that's about it, and old genealogy and directories. But like, what kind of research was it? Was it deep diving into old newspapers, or what kind of stuff was that like?
So it was a very interesting career, and it wasn't quite what I had thought it would be when I started, but it was, but I'm very stubborn. And so I decided to stick it out, and I'm glad I did. So intelligence work is very interesting. I actually ended up having a pretty broad career, even though most of the time it was spent in analysis. I ended up working for several agencies. So I was not only at the National Security Agency, which is a very technical agency. The work there is very technical. So there was a lot more math and science than I ever thought I would need to know. But that's part of what made it interesting, the challenge of trying to master something that I didn't think I'd been told my whole life I didn't have an aptitude for, and it turned out that was wrong, that I just didn't have a teacher yet who could make it real click for me. I ended up going to CIA for a long time. I was a national intelligence officer, which is, yeah, like top of the stack. And then I ended up going into technology for the last 10 years of my career. So I've been the director of a research lab, and I was the office director on a big technology forecasting project. And I went to work for Rand as a senior technology analyst. I guess what I'm trying to say is career in intelligence can be so many things, and chances are it will be, because you are constantly being asked, things change, situations change, mission changes, and you're constantly needing to adjust and try something new, because your agency needs you to, your country needs you to. And so you're always accepting these new challenges, and it ends up making for a career you never thought you'd have, but is quite fascinating. And it's also super rigorous. So, you can't guess when you're briefing the president. You really have to have your facts in a row. And there's methodologies for analysis, like, so that your process is rigorous. And there's a lot of checks and balances for that. Um, and so it's something that it's more involved than people might think, but it teaches you a lot of great skills that I was then able to carry over to writing novels. So in a way, I think it's really enhanced my ability to write fiction, even though we don't write fiction in the intelligence business. But it made me a great researcher. It made me a great like proofreader. You can't have typos when you're
Mhm.
briefing the president, right? 20 pounds or 2 pounds, it makes a big difference how much uranium, right, you find in a bag or something. So and I don't know that a lot of people generally have an appreciation for how much, like, different skills go into writing a novel. But I've found that having that background in intelligence really, I think, was helpful and made me a better novelist.
I know that with Red Widow, you used a lot of your intelligence background for that. Are you planning on including those characters? I haven't finished the novel, so I can't I don't know the ending or anything like that. But are you planning on continuing that line of intelligence agency for your next novel, or are you writing a next novel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky. For now, at least, Putnam is actually supporting. They publish both the lines, so they do my historical horror, and they do my spy novel, and they have bought a second one. So I am at work on the second one, and it's also been picked up by Fox for a TV
Ooh,
series.
that's
So
exciting.
yeah, it's my first. This is the first time I've gotten this far in the process, and so that's been super gratifying. But I guess I should say that, because some people, I think some readers get kind of confused, like, why would I want to write two such different types of books, right? Especially when I started with these historicals with supernatural elements, right? And then people find out I was an intelligence analyst, and they're like, what is that all about? Why didn't you just write a spy novel first? It's sort of a funny story, but the short of it is, The Taker and the books I've written since, those types of stories, those kind of magical stories, are stories that I always enjoyed reading. So those were the types of stories I was drawn to writing. But I'd always wished I could write a spy novel, especially once, I'd written a few books and I understood now really, how to tell a story better, because I feel very strongly about how the intelligence community is portrayed in popular culture, in movies and TV shows and books. And, a lot of what most people think about when they think of the spy business comes from that. And while it's entertaining, it's not always doing justice to the people who've actually served in it. So the challenge for me was, could I write a book that would be fairly truthful, really show a good reflection of the people who work in the field, but still be entertaining? And I think so far, the reviews we've gotten for Red Widow seem to bear that out. And that's what I'm really proud about, because, I've worked 35 years in the business. I've worked with a lot of people. And yeah, there's been a few duds, but for the most part, they're wonderful people. They're very patriotic, right? They give over all of themselves to the job, sometimes to the detriment of their families and themselves. And that comes out in Red Widow too. But, I wanted to, especially the women who I don't think are very well represented in pop culture, or misrepresented, I should say, in pop culture. But they're extremely professional and ethical and dedicated and smart. And, I wanted to see characters in a novel that reflected those women, the women that I knew. And so that's why I'm really, really happy to have had the opportunity to write Red Widow.
Um, I'm gonna ask some book questions. So first off, what's your favorite all-time book?
That's so hard
I
because
know it's hard.
yeah, don't you find you sort of that changes over time? Sometime a certain book will really appeal to you and another book will really appeal to you. And if I tell you the truth, you're going to think I'm completely insane. Um, one of the books that has stayed with me through my whole life is a Shirley Jackson book, but it's not the one you're thinking of as a horror writer. It's Life Among the Savages, which is a collection of essays that she wrote for, I think, like Good Housekeeping or something. And I read that when I was like a little kid, which is very weird because it's this very dry historical look at this very sophisticated, New York writer who ends up getting dragged off to the wilds of Vermont by her husband when he gets a position at Bennington. And everything about country life just perplexes her. And she's a young mother and she's got these young kids. But I don't know why it appealed to me when I was like 7 years old. I don't know. I read it almost once a year because I think I get my sort of bewildered outlook on life from that. There's just something about that book that, she's an outsider looking in and questioning and everything is bizarre. Her children are bizarre. Her neighbors are bizarre, the circumstances she finds herself in, bizarre. And that has just stayed with me my whole life. So read it. It's great, actually. It is just great. Life Among the Savages, Shirley Jackson.
I'll put it on my to be read list.
Let me know what you think about it.
I will. All right. All-time favorite, I guess, what horror novel do you prefer if you have to recommend horror to somebody?
Oh, that's a really tough one because again, there's so many different types of horror and recommending a book. I know, we all have books we love and we just
Right.
love to talk to somebody else about that book, right? But especially with horror, I kind of feel like you have to match it up to the person. So
Right.
it
I feel
depends.
like Becky Spratford is just yelling at me right now.
Oh,
for-
no, I don't want to get you in trouble with Becky. Don't let me get you in trouble. Because there's classics, like Dracula. I actually love Dracula. I think that's a really, such a wonderful atmospheric book. There's been a lot of horror written lately that I think people would love if they would give it a try. But that brings up another point, and something that I've been saying for a couple of years is I really feel like these days horror is a big tent. It's not just the kinds of like Stephen King books or Dean Koontz books that people tend to think of when they think of horror. But it's although Stephen King is actually a great example because he doesn't just write one type of book. He writes for feelings, certain feelings of dread and suspense and um, revulsion and that sort of thing, and it can take different forms, and that's kind of what horror's done these days. After The Hunger, I was very lucky. The book was fairly successful, and so I was asked to blurb a lot of books, and I was really surprised. It seemed like I was getting these books that in another day and age you might not consider horror. They were more on the domestic suspense or psychological suspense side, and they certainly evoke feelings of horror and dread when you're reading it. And so why not? You can consider them horror too. My friend Riley Sager wrote a book, and I forget which one it was, but he felt that it was very close to Rosemary's Baby. Well, that's a horror story. You might not think of Riley as a horror writer, but if he's writing a story like Rosemary's Baby, that is certainly a horror story.
All right, and last book question, what are you looking forward to reading next?
Ooh, like just this past Tuesday, new release Tuesday, there were so many good books. The week before that, so many good books. It's so hard right now. Well, I want to read Razor Blade Tears, S.A. Sean Cosby's latest book. I've just heard such wonderful things about it. Laura Lippman's latest book, Dream Girl, just came out. And I am dying to read that because I love everything that Laura Lippman writes. And I'm sure, especially her last five or so have just been so outstanding. So I'm dying to read that. And I know I'm forgetting, there's so many. I mean, it's just crazy. Um, I should have written down a list. What about you? What are you looking forward to reading?
Well, I have an advanced copy of Grady Hendrix' Final Girls support group, so I'm like almost done with that, and that's just been like I love the concept of Final Girls, and I got to watch him and Stephen Graham Jones. They participated in a terror talk with the library out in California a couple weeks back, and discovered that Stephen Graham Jones is also writing a novel focused on Final Girls. Um,
Oh, was that My Heart is a Chainsaw?
is that My Heart is a Chainsaw?
Yeah, it
With
is
the
great.
camps? With the 2 camps?
Well,
Or
it's so hard to know because, first of all, he's prolific.
right.
He's been doing some great books lately, but My Heart is a Chainsaw is about a Native American teenage girl who's convinced that this new girl who comes to town is a final girl.
Yes, okay, that is it. And
Yeah,
so
it's great.
and then they were both talking about how there was another person in the horror collective that was also writing something about Final Girls, and I was just like, why is this the year of Final Girls? Like we had Paul Tremblay's Survivor song last year, which was like terrible for the pandemic, and now that we're all out and about, we've got Final Girls everywhere, and I'm like, are we gonna survive? Are we gonna make it?
Yeah, it is a funny zeitgeist, isn't it? That this theme comes out, and there's probably even a couple more because I think what you're saying, it's really ringing a bell that I've heard
Hmm.
of more books that sort of have that theme, even if they're not explicit, about final girls. But
Hmm.
yeah, very
Um,
good.
yeah, I have to do some more research. We're doing a what's hot in horror next week, so I'm like, I have to start writing my list now so I can get everybody's in. Like, there's too many. Like, I've started following like every other horror author on Twitter, and I'm just like, there are too many of you, and I don't have time. I
Yeah.
just finished. Sorry, I just finished. Uh, Children of Chicago
Mm.
by Cynthia.
Cynthia Palello. I blurbed it, and I can't pronounce her name.
I
We
feel
met at
so bad,
StokerCon like a couple
right?
years ago. Yeah, it was very good.
And that I loved that novel, and I was very excited when she started talking about that she's going to write another story centered in the Chicago area, because obviously we're very close to it, so we interact with those people all the time. So I was just like, I love a good horror like folklore novel. Like, those are the good ones. So
Oh, okay. Well, certainly got a lot to choose from. You're right. It's been a banner year. I mean, last year was a great year for horror,
mhm.
and it just seems to be continuing. The trick is convincing more people to pick up the books.
Right.
I mean, that's an issue I have. I can't tell you so many times people have come up and they heard about the Hunger, they heard about the Deep, they love the Titanic, and then they say, "Oh, that sounds fascinating. Oh, but I can't read it. I don't read horror." And I try to tell them, it's not a black or white thing. It's more like a sliding scale. And
Mhm.
I don't know, I should ask you, did you think The Hunger was particularly horrific or like something that would scare you? I mean, not the Stephen King blurb notwithstanding. Um,
I think we all kind of agreed in our discussion that that while there was that sense of dread that came while reading it, you like the bad things are going to happen and you know that they're going to happen. It wasn't scary horror. Like, and that's different. I know reading like Joe Hill's Heart-Shaped Box, I was terrified reading that book. Like,
Mm.
you know, reading The Cipher, like I was saying earlier, reading The Cipher, our next book by Kathy Koja, that book, like, it's shocking. Like it's a shock to the system immediately, whereas yours was this slow buildup of dread, and you're like, the bad ending's gonna come. And for those of us who have knowledge of the Donner Party, like you're like, okay, so when do they start eating everybody? Like, you know, and so it's that kind of, you know, it wasn't a shock to the system horror. It was just that uneasy feeling that you would get throughout it.
And that's one of the things that I like about, I mean, it's horror is for the most part really good storytelling. And I think folks who aren't familiar with the genre don't realize that. They think it's a particular kind of story, uh, and don't realize that there's probably at least one horror story out there for you that's going to hit your sweet spot, that's going to tell you a story in the way you need to have it told to you, that's going to have characters that are going to speak to you, that's going to have values that are going to resonate with you. But it's just a matter of finding that story. But that's true of any book. You know, it's very rare that you can just willy-nilly pick a book off the shelf and it's gonna, make you happy, I think.
All right. Margaret, do you have any last questions before we go? Otherwise, have you ever played Oregon Trail? Did you ever play that as a young adult? I guess you would have been an adult when that came out.
Yeah, that completely, I missed that completely. Yes, some of my younger coworkers told me about that later. No, yeah, thank goodness for Oregon Trail. I mean, at least people have some, familiarization with that period.
Did you ever want to go play it?
But it's an 8-bit game, right? So
Yeah.
chances are I couldn't even find the technology to play it on.
Well, no, it's available on Internet Archives.
Oh,
You,
really?
yeah, if you go
Okay.
online to Internet Archives and search for it, you can find all three versions of it. So you
Huh.
can get the Super 8-bit or the color edition from like 96 or something like that.
I wonder how long I'd survive.
I never survived. I've never gotten to the end. I've played it so much as a kid, but I never got to the end.
That's so funny. Yeah, I probably should give it a try.
All right. So Margaret said that she doesn't have any other questions. So I'm going to thank you for coming and participating with us and having a great conversation. I really appreciate it, and we
Well,
really appreciate it.
thank you. I had a great time. Thanks for reading the book. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Yeah. And then again, if I find any questions or if I get any, I'll just tweet them at you and share it out.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much. This was a great time.
Thank you. I had so much fun.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.